Welcome. My name is Rosemary Jarrod, Relationship and Life Transformational Coach from Cape Town in South Africa. And today I have a very inspirational guest who is a specialized coffee roaster, owner and founder of Faber CoffeeSmith. So without further ado, Jarrod, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out to chat to us.
Hi Rose, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I'm based out in Durbanville on a small holding Klein Friesland, and it's a fully organic farm. We try to run the entire farm off the grid, so we're very environmentally friendly. The whole farm runs off solar. We're self-sufficient when it comes to water. So the roasting process as well, I do as environmentally friendly as possible as well. So the roaster I have is a very low emission, energy efficient roaster, and it runs off of our solar system.
You can take us on a journey from the green coffee plant. It's quite a journey until you are going to share your secret of the perfect cup of coffee.
Rose, look, it is, to be honest, it's a deep rabbit hole, the coffee world. So I'll try and keep it as simple and broad as possible. But there are really three main steps in the process, from the plant through to when you actually have a cup of coffee, and that is the green bean side of it, which involves the farmers and how they grow it. To the roasting side is the second step. And then finally, the third step being the actual brewing step. So starting at the green bean side, I like to, I'm very particular when it comes to which cultivar of coffee plant I actually pick. So you'll find coffees that are referred to as, for instance, a washed coffee. Now, what that means is a washed coffee is when the farmer removes the flesh, these cherry fleshes from the seeds, through putting these all the cherries in water troughs and allowing the water to basically make that flesh very soft, and it eventually just sort of comes off. There are a couple of other steps to it, but that's the simple part of it. It's essentially washed off the flesh, and you end up with a green bean. The other very common method is what they call the natural method. So what the farmer would do, they would go and pick all these cherries off of the coffee bushes and then lie them out on beds for a couple of months out in the sun. And they would just lie there and dry. And eventually that flesh just sort of cracks off and breaks off, and you're left with the seed. You will see coffees, especially in the specialty world, that are referred to as washed coffees and natural. Those are the two most common. Now, that's purely the process in which the farmer has taken to remove the seed out of the cherry itself. Going on to the roast. The second phase, the roast, look, again, it's I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong way to roast, but obviously at the end of the day, taste is king. So you want to do whatever is going to make the coffee taste as best as you can. The processing method, the cultivar, the origin, those all play a role in how that bean roasts. And there are a whole host of different ways to brew. Now, an espresso machine is simply one of the brewing methods. That's all it is. So sometimes you'll see somebody selling a brand or sell a bean as an espresso bean. Now, the bean itself is no particular special bean. Yes, there are certain green beans that also work better through espresso, but they've roasted the bean generally slightly darker for espresso. 80% of a restaurant's sales are generally cappuccinos. If you're gonna make a cappuccino, you need something that's got enough intensity that can cut through that milk and pull flavor through that milk. French press is going to run for 4 minutes. That in its own, which is standard, that in its own right tells you that your coffee grind can't be too fine, because if it's going to be brewing for 4 minutes, it needs to be more on the coarser side. Again, it's all down to contact time between the water and the coffee. If you're going to put a very fine ground in a French press and let it brew for 4 minutes, it will come out extremely, it will over extract, as we call it. Espresso, you can, as I said earlier, is based on time. So you're talking 28 seconds, for instance, to pull a shot of espresso. So because you've got such a short period, you need that coffee to be really fine, so that when the contact between water and coffee happens, it can extract really fast. Back to the Turkish coffee, that's probably the only coffee that's finer ground than espresso. So you hit that, like I said, you go on that sliding scale of coarse to fine. You hit espresso, which is really fine, and then you go one lower and you get to your Turkish coffee, which is even finer. When it comes to the brewing methods, you talk about the sludge. Certain brewing methods will produce cleaner cups than others. So, for example, a French press has a metal, generally a metal sort of sieve in it, which removes quite a lot of the fines, but not everything. You often in a French press cup, you'll find at the bottom is a little layer of coffee still. You'll get those fines that come through. But then if you did, for instance, a typical filter machine, or any pour over that uses a paper filter, the paper you'll find will give you a very clean cup of coffee. You want to find that sweet spot, what works for you. The general rule of thumb is coarse or medium to coarse. On the green side plays a role. The cultivar, all of that can definitely play a role. Even the altitude that the bean has been grown at can impact the density of that bean, which will then could impact how it grinds, and then therefore impact how it extracts. So it all plays a role. Great in terms of sourcing specialty coffee, a whole host of, from our standard sort of commodity grade coffee through a big range of specialty coffees, and they source them from around the world. And it gives me a nice selection. But as I said earlier, when actually choosing what bean am I looking for, what am I after, I start with the plant variety, the crema has a few factors to it. What happens when you roast a coffee bean? It's naturally got CO2 in a coffee bean, in a green bean. Now you put it in the roaster, you roast it, and what happens then is the coffee bean releases a lot of that CO2. Now, you'll hear roasters degas their coffee for about a day. So once you've roasted, not immediately brew with it. And the degassing they talk about is actually CO2 that's still being released out of that bean. Because sometimes if it's too early and too fresh, you can get that CO2 and it can actually, affect the coffee negatively. Now you'll see coffee bags often have the little valve on the bag. People tend to think that's to smell the coffee. It's not to smell the coffee. It's a one-way valve. So one, oxygen can't enter so that the coffee can't oxidize and go stale. And two, it allows the CO2 that's still being released off of those beans to escape. What the crema is as you're brewing that coffee, you've ground the coffee now, and now you've brewed it. It's still busy releasing CO2. And that CO2 then pulls through your brewed coffee, and that's what creates that crema. It's a very good indication of how fresh your coffee is. Robusta grows at much lower altitudes than Arabica, so it's actually easier to grow in that regard. It's also it's very hardy. It doesn't get affected by disease and weather as easily. It has a very high caffeine content, generally higher than Arabica. It lacks the flavor profiles and the aromas that Arabica happens to give off. Generally what guys would do is, if they put in a blend together and they want to give it a bit more of a kick, because the Robusta has a very high caffeine content, they might add like a bit of Robusta in. It's cheap, so it tends to bring price points down, versus these guys, people that go full out Arabica is always going to cost more because the beans cost more. I can tell you that they especially over recent years, a hell of a lot of new roasters have popped up. So yeah, there are tons of them out there. And it's not just your big sort of 8 roasters in the Cape or whatever it may be, because there are a handful of really big guys. Yeah. It's not just those guys producing good coffee. A lot of the small guys are producing really, really good coffee, sometimes better coffee.
I went to a coffee place in town, in De Waterkant, in Cape Town.
Yeah.
And they have all these amazing ways of serving coffee. And they have siphon and push and pull and, espresso and all of those. But they also have this 24-hour drip for coffee. Yeah. So for 24 hours, the water drips through, and you can then have like 200 mils of coffee, which I had, and I had it cold.
It's a cold brew. So at lower temperatures, you got to extract much longer. And that's the idea. They put it at low temperature, and they've got their own ratios between water and coffee.
Yeah.
They're quite a lot. And yeah, I mean, a cold brew, if you do it correctly, can be phenomenal.
The flavor was absolutely phenomenal.
You would use in a cold brew, for example, and even what you mentioned earlier, the siphons that they would use. These are typical coffees that I like to roast and play around with a lot. These would not be a coffee that you'd necessarily put through your espresso machine. So yeah, I mean, that's when these other coffees that are medium or even to the lighter end of roast profiles get really exciting when you start playing around with these other brew methods.
Jarrod, the other thing that I've also learned doing a coffee tasting here and there is that you have like double the aromas and bouquets that you have in wine tasting.
Coffee and wine are often seen as sort of their sisters, because they've both kind of stood the test of time, and they have a lot in common when you really get into it. The South African market, we grow up and we are well educated in wine. We'll walk into a store and say, right, we'll start and we'll go, do we want white or red? And then we'll go, okay, red. And we'll go through all the different cultivars and we decide, right, we want a Merlot. Do we want it from the Constantia area or the
Exactly.
Durbanville area or Stellenbosch? And then, and we can go on like that. So with coffee, we're not quite there. I think we'll get there, but people still just look at an origin, for example. They'll say, okay, well, we want a Brazil. But that's like kind of saying I want a South African wine. It's very open-ended.
How do you view cappuccinos, Jarrod?
There are a whole host of ways to utilize that espresso, which makes espresso exciting. It's not just one way of drinking espresso. You pull that shot and you can go wild, you can go crazy with it. Now, one of the methods, one of the things to do with it, which has become which is for a long time been the most popular and most common way to use it, is in a cappuccino, where you really just pull in a shot or a double shot. You stretch in some milk, and you pour in the milk with mixing it with the espresso. Now, it's pretty straightforward in theory. But to make a good cappuccino, there's a lot of work that actually goes into it, and it follows this entire chain that I've just discussed, from the green coffee and how and the method and the cultivar and so forth, to how it's roasted, and to eventually to the barista. Now, I think if you can nail a cappuccino, if you can nail firstly a coffee that can go through an espresso machine and have it work with a cappuccino and allow the barista to not have too much room for error, I think that's a feat in its own right. And then once you get it a step further and actually prepare that cappuccino, which is down to barista skills, something the roaster may not even know how to do.
Yeah.
It's a long chain of human intervention along with all these sciences, and so yeah, I think cappuccino, I'm personally, it's not my favorite style to drink, but for a lot of people, it is their favorite style, and I think it's an extremely difficult thing to master. I don't think it's as straightforward as a lot of people think.
When you have a good cappuccino, it's amazing. What a lot of people request now is like a dirty chai with a triple shot.
Have as many shots as you like. I don't play around with anything chai related or any of those type of things. I don't, it's just I stick to coffee. Just coffee and milk. There's guys around the world you'll find drink coffee in the most, obscure ways. But again, if that's what they like, then that's great. I think from a roaster's point of view, I just want to try and make sure that I can supply and produce the best roasted beans to these cafes that are actually serving these coffees to help lift their game. Last year, Nicaragua produced some amazing coffees. The climates were just right. The crops came out phenomenal. And I'd say that the barn roast is still going. It's still selling. I haven't changed it. It's red and yellow Katui is the variety, and it's from Nicaragua, a good coffee region in Nicaragua. And it's just it's just done very well. But I've had some others that have done amazing that I've just haven't had a lot of supply because the crops are small. That Pacamara in particular. I had a pea berry from Kenya that was
I
I had
had
a
that as
Kiwi
well.
from Kenya. It was very, very popular.
Mm.
So yeah, look, what I really try hard to achieve is for not one of my coffees to taste the same. I don't want someone to come in and taste all my coffees and say to me they love all of them, because then they taste the same. I
Yeah.
want them to
You
say
don't
to me
want them
that
to
they
taste
love
this.
exactly. I want them to tell me they love this one, this one, this one, but the others aren't really what they're after. Then I know they taste. I've got different flavor profiles going, and that's what I'm after.
So Jarrod, this started in COVID. Am I right?
Um, it was not a response to COVID. It was coincidence.
Yeah.
So I actually started planning the business in 2019. I started getting everything in place, and the day I had my first bag of beans bagged, ready to go, roasted, good to go, it was 2 days before our initial lockdown, so March last year. And it was just
Wow.
complete coincidence that when I was ready to start selling, 2 days later, lockdown kicked in.
March the
So
year
look,
before, 2019. Yeah, 2020. Yeah.
2020. So I started
Yeah.
planning the business in 2019, but end of 2019, but I only got to the point in March where I was ready to, everything was going and good up and running. And I trial run a whole host of beans and different roasting methods. And when I eventually got to what I wanted, lockdown kicked in 2 days later, which was interesting because what it did was it just threw my initial marketing plans sort of on its head. But it opened other opportunities. I suddenly there was this home market that you could tap into, because people were looking to suddenly make really good coffee at home, as opposed to being in the office and walking out of their office and going down the road to their local cafe where they would make it for them. So in 2020, the suppliers, a lot of the home espresso machines were all sold out at all the suppliers. Everyone was starting to make their own coffee at home, their own good coffee at home, which allowed me to get in. So initially, all my customers were just home customers, and obviously as COVID, went through its phases, the restaurants opened up, and it allowed me to start supplying some restaurants and so forth. But yeah.
So Jarrod, tell me, so if people, I mean, what an inspirational story and so interesting. I can listen to you all night. But if people want to get hold of you, how do they get hold of you?
I would say the easiest, Rose, my website, fabercoffee.co.za. I've got an online store. You can go and place orders there. My details are on there. You can contact me directly to ask for recommendations or whatever it may be. I've got some brewing techniques I've uploaded on there. There's some videos of the roasting process on there. So yeah, my website, like I said, it's fabercoffee.co.za, or just Google Faber CoffeeSmith. And yeah, that's probably the simplest way.
Jarrod Faber, thank you so very, very much. I think this has been inspirational, fascinating. I mean, I've hung on to every word that's come out of your mouth because I love coffee. So thank you so very, very much. And just good luck for the future. And contact Jarrod if you want some of his amazing, beautiful coffee. Thank you, Jarrod, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rose, for having me on. I also do really appreciate it. And yeah, it was great. It was great chatting to you.